Hey, Rising Church, welcome to another round of Grows. I believe we're in round 4. I hope you've been having a great time discussing and, kind of sharpening each other as we continue talking about God's will and what that looks like and how do we interpret that and what that means and how we can seek God's will over our own. And so we're going to be looking at a passage tonight that I think is pretty familiar to most of us. It happens in a place called the Garden of Gethsemane. It's on the night that Jesus betrayed. And it's actually one of my favorite places we go to in Israel. And hopefully we're going to be there in a little over a month and be able to sit in the Garden of Gethsemane and remember this is where this took place. But in the Garden of Gethsemane, if you know the story, Jesus he's praying. He tells his disciples, hey, pray with me. He actually uses 3 words in Matthew's gospel that are pretty intense words. He says, I am sorrowful, which is like I'm just filled with this deep, deep grief and this sadness, deep emotional pain. He says, I am troubled, which is kind of means I'm distressed. And he says, I am overwhelmed. He's like, I'm overwhelmed. I'm overcome with sorrow. And so Jesus is kind of in a tough spot. He's really feeling the pressure because he knows what's about to take place. He knows what's coming. And his will is, I'm not excited about this, right? As he looks ahead, he sees the crucifixion, he sees the pain, he sees all that, and he's disturbed. He's emotionally distressed, if you will. And it comes this moment, and I think, again, most of us know the story, is that Jesus is praying, and he prays this prayer that I think is super relatable to us as we talk about kind of our stance and what we do when we kind of are faced with difficult decisions on whether we're going to do what God says or we're going to do what the world says. Are we going to conform to the pattern of the world, or are we going to kind of diverge off and kind of go our own way and be rebels for Jesus? And Jesus says this, he says, Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. He's like, I don't want to do this. This is not my personal preference for my life. This is not what I'm looking forward to in that sense. But he says, yet, as you probably know, not my will, but yours be done. He says, not my will, not my desire, not my wishes, not my personal preferences, what I think is good, pleasing, and perfect, but what you say is your will, your plan, your desire, your wish for me in my life. I want that to be fulfilled. And so even in this moment of distress where I'm like freaking out a little bit, it's like I'm just going to say, at the end of the day, I just want what you want over what I want. Your will be done. I love this word be done because it means it's kind of the word you would often use to say like when a woman gives birth to a child. And so he's saying, basically, I want your will to be birthed. I want your will to become. I want your will to happen. That's what I desire. And I love this because it kind of, and you're going to talk about this in your Grove a little bit, but have you really thought about that? That Jesus too had this conflict, like, am I going to do what God says, what God's will is, what I know he wants me to do, or am I going to do what I want to do? And what's in my best interest, according to what I think, what's he going to do? And obviously, you guys know, we all know the story, and Jesus perseveres, right? And he keeps going, and he stands up at that moment, and he sees them coming towards him, and he walks towards them because he's like, I'm going to do what God called me to do. I don't know if you know this or not, but Garden of Gethsemane literally means olive press. And if you ever go to Israel with me, you're going to see what an olive press looks like. And it's like when you think of Jesus in the olive press being pressed, and all that pressure on him, that's kind of what it was like. He was under this pressure. And so it kind of reminds me, I feel like, in a sense, Jesus was almost kind of like wrestling with God. Like, am I going to do what God says, or am I going to do what I say? And I think it's very common for us to be in a very similar situation where we wrestle with God, and we're kind of like, well, I want this, but this is what you say, and so what am I going to do here? And am I going to do what my will is, or am I going to do what your will is? And we kind of wrestle with God. And we looked at a passage earlier in Isaiah where it talks about kind of woe to those who quarrel with their maker and kind of argue with their maker and kind of say, right? And I'm not going to follow you, and I just want to do my own thing. And it kind of reminds me of the story in Genesis. I think most of you are probably familiar with this one with Jacob. And Jacob's kind of a squirrely character, not really a great guy for most of his life. And so you're kind of like, why is this guy even in the Bible? Like, he seems like kind of a jerk. But he's in there, right? Because he's a real human. And he's wrestling with God. Literally, he's wrestling with the angel of the Lord. He's wrestling, in essence, with God at this moment. And if you know the story, it kind of happens where he's wrestling all night with God. He's trying to get God's blessing, and he wrestles with him until daybreak. And finally, this is what happens at the end of the wrestling match, if you will. In Genesis 32:20, Sorry, I can't see anymore. 28. It says, then the man said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel. And this is where we get the name Israel, of the country and the nation of Israel. He says, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. And I think a lot of us, we don't really think about, well, what does the word Israel mean? Like, what does that actually mean? And Israel, in Hebrew, it literally means, well, he says it right there. He says, you have struggled with God. It's the word God, El, and this word Sarah, which means strive and kind of wrestle with, if you will, persist. And it's kind of this idea that we kind of always think of as Jacob, like Jacob wrestled and he strived with and he persevered against God, like I'm going to have my way, right? But really it's the other way around. It's God strives, God contends, God wrestles, God perseveres with Jacob. And God perseveres with us because God's like, I want you to desire my will, but you're so busy trying to wrestle with me, trying to get your will, and you're trying to quarrel with me and argue with me. And if you'll just submit, then I can do what I want to do through you and in you. And so as we kind of unpack these kind of two stories, I don't know if they're parallels, but if we kind of look at these two stories in your Grove tonight, I just really want you to think about yourself. And how often, maybe every single day, do we kind of like Jacob, we kind of just wrestle with God? Or we're kind of like Jesus in the garden where we're like, oh man, I'm just struggling and I don't know what to do and I'm distressed and I'm in emotional pain and I don't know what to do. And I just really think that this is a better option, but God, what am I going to do? And I hope that through this series that we're going to come to the conclusion every single time, whether it involves pain and suffering or not, that we're just going to say yes. We'll just choose to say yes to God's will like Jesus did, knowing that God is up to something greater than what we can see in the moment, and that he's going to see us through it, and that we're not walking alone, and that, hey, I'm just going to say yes. I'm not going to be the one that's striving against God and quarreling with him. I'm just going to submit to him and say yes, and allow him to be God, and I am not. And so as we kind of consider that, I think that's something we do every single day. Every single day we wrestle with this idea of I'm going to do what the world says or I'm going to do what God says. I'm going to do what I'm told by culture and by society and by whatever influences in the media that you're listening to or even your friends or whatever else, or am I going to listen to what God's word says? And I hope that in that wrestling bout that we will choose to say, you know what, God, your will be done, not mine. Your wishes, not mine, because I know yours are better at the end of the day. And so I'm just going to submit to what you say. And I want to be one that doesn't strive with you. I don't necessarily want to be one that you are always striving and contending with me, because I want to be one who just says yes. So hopefully that gives you some food for thought as we kick off our session tonight, and we'll see where it all goes. But we'll check back in with you next week.